One of my favorite books is called The Art of Argument by Douglas N. Walton. It's actually a textbook, but it's quite an easy read, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to learn how to argue better. In this video, I want to share with you some of the key insights from this book. In particular, we will focus on chapters 2 and 3, which discuss about logic and fallacies. So if you've ever wanted to improve your critical thinking skills or just get a better understanding of how arguments work, then keep watching. Chapter 2 is all about mastering logic. But before diving into that, let me quickly introduce myself. I am a PhD candidate in sociology, and this channel is all about making sociology and research accessible and interesting to everyone. Now, let's get started. Walton defines an argument as a sequence of sentences where the last one is supposed to follow from the others. So when we are engaged in an argument with someone, whether it's about politics, personal relationships, or any other topic, what we really doing is presenting a series of statements and trying to convince the other person that the conclusion we reached is the right one. If you think about it, being able to construct a good argument is a pretty important skill to have, something that you use every single day, not only in your professional life, but also in your personal life. There are two main components of an argument. One is the premises, and the other is the conclusion. The premises are the statements that you present to support your position, and the conclusion is the position itself. So here's a simple example. All men are mortal. I am a man. Therefore, I am mortal. In this case, the premises are all men are mortal, and I am a man, and the conclusion is, therefore, I am mortal. The way it works is that the conclusion follows from the premises. This means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. However, there is another type of relationship between premises and conclusions, and that is when the conclusion does not follow from the premises. This is what happens in many arguments, and it leads to fallacies. According to Walton, a fallacy is simply a mistake in reasoning. Let's look at this example. All dogs are mammals. Some mammals are hairy. Therefore, all dogs are hairy. This argument is invalid because the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Just because all dogs are mammals doesn't mean that they are all hairy. Being hairy is a characteristic of some mammals, but not all of them. Therefore, we cannot conclude that all dogs are hairy just because they are mammals. The main reason why people commit fallacies is because they do not know how to construct a valid argument. But the good news is that it's a skill that can be learned. You just need to practice and train your brain to think in a more logical way. And this is exactly what Chapter 2 of this book is all about. It provides a step-by-step guide on how to construct a valid argument and avoid common fallacies. Let's go over some of the key points from this chapter. First off, we already know that an argument is a sequence of sentences where the last one is supposed to follow from the others. This means that the conclusion should logically follow from the premises. However, sometimes we try to make our conclusion true by adding irrelevant information or by using emotionally charged language. For example, consider this argument. All cats are mammals. Garfield is a cat. Garfield is a mammal. The conclusion is indeed true, but it doesn't follow from the premises. The second premise is irrelevant. We could have just as easily said that Garfield is orange and got the same result. That is because the color of the cat has nothing to do with whether it is a mammal or not. So what makes this argument valid is not the premises, but the relationship between them and the conclusion. So the first step in mastering logic is to identify the conclusion and the premises. This may seem obvious, but it's actually quite difficult. Many times we do not even realize that we are committing a fallacy until someone points it out to us. For example, let's look at this argument. You never wear a hat. It's cold outside. Therefore, you should wear a hat. In this case, the conclusion is you should wear a hat. The first premise is you never wear a hat. And the second premise is it's cold outside. At first glance, it might seem like the conclusion follows from the premises, but upon closer inspection, we realize that this is not the case. The first premise tells us about the person's past behavior, but it doesn't tell us anything about what they should do in the present or future. The second premise tells us about the weather, but it doesn't tell us anything about the person's preferences or needs. Therefore, the conclusion does not follow from the premises and the argument is invalid. Now that we know how to identify the conclusion and the premises, we can start looking for fallacies. A fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that makes the conclusion not follow from the premises. There are many different types of fallacies, and each one has its own name and rules. For example, ad hominem, ad misericordiam, ad populum, bandwagon appeal, appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, appeal to ignorance, false dilemma, hasty generalization, etc. But here's the thing. You don't really need to memorize all these fallacies and their rules. Instead, what you really need to learn is how to construct a valid argument. Once you know how to construct a valid argument, you will be able to spot fallacies on your own. So the next step is to learn how to construct a valid argument. This can be done by following 4 simple rules. The first rule is to use accurate information. This means that you should use facts, not opinions. For example, if you're arguing that the death penalty is wrong, don't say something like, "I feel like the death penalty is wrong." Instead, say something like, "The death penalty is wrong." The second rule is to use relevant information. This means that you should only use information that is relevant to the issue at hand. For example, if you're arguing that we should ban plastic bags, don't talk about how plastic bottles are bad for the environment. The third rule is to use sufficient information. This means that you should use enough information to support your conclusion. For example, if you're arguing that we should ban plastic bags, don't just say that they pollute. Explain how they pollute and why that's a problem. The fourth rule is to use clear information. This means that you should use language that is clear and concise. Avoid using jargon or technical terms that the other person may not understand. By following these 4 rules, you will be able to construct a valid argument that is more likely to persuade the other person. And that's basically what Chapter 2 is all about. It covers all of these topics in much more detail and provides you with the tools you need to construct a strong argument. Now let's move on to Chapter 3, which is all about mastering fallacies. As we discussed earlier, a fallacy is simply a mistake in reasoning. When you commit a fallacy, your argument is not valid, meaning that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. The problem is that most people don't even realize when they're committing a fallacy. They just think that they're making a perfectly valid argument. That's why it's so important to learn how to identify common fallacies. There are many different types of fallacies, and Chapter 3 covers some of the most common ones. For example, ad hominem, which literally translates to towards the person. This is when you attack the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. For example, instead of saying, "The argument you presented is flawed," you say, "You're a stupid idiot and I'm not listening to your stupid argument." Ad hominem attacks are fallacious because they don't provide any evidence for or against the conclusion. Appeal to authority, which is when you cite an authority on the subject to support your argument. For example, Dr. X says that climate change is real, so we should believe that climate change is real. This fallacy is committed when the authority cited is not actually an authority on the subject. For example, if Dr. X is a physicist, but climate change is a sociological issue, then citing him as an authority on climate change would be a fallacy. False dilemma, which is when you present only 2 options, when in reality, there are more than 2 options. For example, either you support the death penalty or you're a murderer. In this case, there are actually more than 2 options. You could argue that the death penalty should be abolished altogether, or that it should be used only in certain cases, and so on. These are just a few examples of the fallacies that are covered in Chapter 3. As I mentioned earlier, you don't really need to memorize all of these fallacies and their rules. Instead, what you really need to learn is how to construct a valid argument. Once you know how to construct a valid argument, you will be able to spot fallacies on your own. And this is exactly what Chapter 3 teaches you how to do. It provides you with the tools you need to analyze arguments and identify common fallacies. Overall, these 2 chapters are a great resource for anyone who wants to improve their critical thinking skills, or just get a better understanding of how arguments work. If you're interested in learning more about logic and fallacies, I highly recommend checking out the book, The Art of Argument. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.